We're carrying on with our talk and our reading of the Book of Esther today. And the things that we've been looking at all throughout the last 3 weeks are the characters of different people in this story and the way in which they demonstrate courage, really. Because in their own little way, that's what all of them have done. So first of all, we started with the courage of conviction. We saw that Queen Vashti, who was degraded and embarrassed and asked to present herself, perhaps wearing just her crown, in front of the whole of the king's court, refused to do that. And she held on to her convictions. And we heard in that message that conviction is the antidote to 1,000 compromises, because 1,000 compromises will lead you to 1,000 regrets. And then 2 weeks ago, we looked at the courage of inconvenience, which was a very inconvenient message, wasn't it? And we focused in on Mordecai, and we really got to know him. We asked ourselves the question, how willing are we to inconvenience ourselves for the sake of the gospel? And we talked about how inconvenience is very often the opportunity that God uses to intervene in different circumstances. How we need to seek those opportunities and then have the courage to step into them, often sacrificing on behalf of others. And today I want to continue looking a bit at Mordecai, but in the sense I want to compare his life to the life of Haman. And so today we're going to look at the courage of calling. And Heather, you're going to come and read verses for us today.
The reading this morning is from Esther 4, verses 1 to 5. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, with fasting, weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why.
So we're looking at the courage of calling this morning. How would you define calling? I'm going to put you to work today. As I said, I'm struggling a bit this morning, so now I'm going to give it over to you. How do you define calling? Come on, what would you use to define calling? Gentle summons, yeah, good one. Anyone else got a way of, how would you define calling? A nudge in the right direction, yeah, excellent, that's a good one. Anyone else? Yeah, absolutely. That still small voice. Well, I would say that it's being compelled probably within your own inner man to do something that perhaps you wouldn't naturally have chosen to do. It doesn't mean you don't have some kind of skill set or need to be able to do that, but it often comes in a way that is external to yourself. It's that nudging within, and sometimes it's not very gentle either. When I was thinking about going to university, I really didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave my job. I've told you this before, and God, he was just on my case all the time, prompting me, pushing me, calling me, until in the end, it clicked in my own mind. The thing about calling is we need to make sure that we don't confuse it with our own compulsions. Because sometimes we really want to do things, don't we? Like we had some friends in the past who had this wonderful idea. They were meant to go off and be part of a mega church in Australia. And so they came to the leaders of the church and their home group leaders, and they asked them to pray, and everybody did. And they said to them, look, we're really sorry, but we don't get that picture. We don't get that sense of feeling. And we think perhaps maybe you would just like to go to Australia, but we're not sure God's actually calling you. And the couple, they were determined to go, and they were like, no, this is definitely it. And so they put out all the feelers, and they even offered to go and work for free for a host of different churches. And of course, churches need people, don't they? And so eventually one church came back to them and said, well, yeah, if you're going to come and work for free, then come. And so the family went, they left everything, they went over to Australia, and after 3 months of working for free for a church, it dawned on them that actually this isn't sustainable, and God's just not opening the doors that we thought he was going to open. And very sadly, they had to come home feeling really rejected and hurt and disappointed. And there is a difference between calling and compulsion. And usually calling comes in a way that it is verified by the Holy Spirit within you and by others. You need to weigh and test a calling. Sometimes we have to be careful where our hearts lead us, because if it's not the Spirit, we can get really hurt. So let's just remind ourselves a little bit about Mordecai. He's Esther's cousin. He's adopted her when she was a child. Her parents died. We don't know how that happened, but Mordecai has stepped in, and he's taken care of Esther, and he looks after her like she is his own daughter. He's a royal official at the king's gate. Now, the gates are where everything happens. Anything to do with community. There's markets, there's buying and selling. There are places where the people gather to distribute gossip and announce new babies being born, or that kind of thing. There are places where the community gather to hear community announcements or have grievances heard and listened to by a judge. And then the administration of justice also happens at the gates. The gates are a sign of power and wealth, and they're a sign of who the king is. And a lot of his subordinates, figures of power, would make decisions and announce new laws at the gates. We know that Mordecai is one of the officials at the gates at this time. And we know that his character, we saw it in our way of looking at it in the last few weeks ago, and we saw that he's a guy that's willing to inconvenience himself for the sake of others. We saw that he is a guy that looks at God's bigger plan, not just the here and now. He's already foiled one plan to kill the king, hasn't he? And he's ready and positioned himself to continue serving. And he demonstrates great courage. Mordecai, he's one of the officials at the gate, and then this announcement is made that everyone has to bow down to the king's second in command, Haman. Anytime he walks past you, you've got to get down on your knees and worship him. Regardless of the consequences, Mordecai has this deep sense of calling and conviction that this just isn't right. And so on this day, Haman is walking along, perhaps he's on his horse, or maybe he's walking with some of his men, and everyone would have been in a procession waiting for him to come. And I can imagine all of Mordecai's peers and his colleagues just kneeling down one by one as Haman approaches. And Mordecai says no. Mordecai says no, and he continues to stand. Now, professionally speaking, Haman is his superior. He should show him respect and honor. And we could think, well, come on, Mordecai, let's just keep the peace here. Everyone else is bowing down. Why can't you just do the same? Especially because you know the kind of guy Haman is. But Mordecai, despite the consequences, refuses to kneel at him, before him. And I think it's probably for a very similar reason that, you know, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to worship those other gods, and they end up in the fiery furnace. And I think that, Mordecai, he sees the bigger picture. He knows that Haman's not just asking for professional respect. He's not just asking for honor for the position that he holds in the king's court. No, he wants people to worship him as though he's a god. When people worshipped in those times, they would do it on their knees. And that's what Haman is asking them to do. And so Mordecai, he has this conviction, this overwhelming calling that he's not going to bow down. He's not going to worship this man. He says, I don't care how big your ego is, Haman. I'm not going to bow down to you, and I am not going to worship you. I worship God and God alone. Think about how much courage that must have taken. It's quite hard for us to assimilate that in our minds, isn't it? Because, when we're asked to be courageous, it might mean standing up to somebody at work, but they're not going to kill us for it, are they? They're not going to take out all our family because of it. They're not going to come into our place of worship and take out everyone that we love. But this is what this is the position that he's in. And he's signing his own death warrant by remaining standing. And he probably doesn't even realize it yet, but he's also signing the death warrant of all of his people. Now, there have been plenty of times in my life when I've let my fears dictate my actions. When I've chosen to take the easy route to keep the peace. When I've made decisions that I wish I hadn't just to keep everybody else happy. When you give in to peer pressure or popular opinion or political correctness or the latest trending hashtag. And I'm sure there have been times when we've all bowed down to things of this world, but here's the thing that I think we need to be careful of is that if we don't know what we believe in, we'll start bowing down to things that we don't even know anything about. We really need to know what it is that we believe and what we stand for in order to remain standing. And a big part of courage is risk-taking. It's risking your reputation, what other people will say about you, what other people think about you. And at the end of the day, courage is doing what's right. Mordecai knew that God was a jealous God and no one should come before him. And he had the courage of calling and conviction to stand firm and not bow down. He's got to be a tough guy, I think, don't you? So we've seen who Mordecai is. Let's turn the coin over. Who's Haman? What does Haman seem like to you? Well, unlike Mordecai, he's wealthy, he's well-positioned, he's powerful, he's got the king's ear, and after the king, he's the second in command, and he's got everything he could want. But clearly, it's not enough. Think about it. How big must his ego be if he needs to make a government mandate to tell everyone to bow down at his feet when he walks past? And in my experience, when someone demands that type of notoriety, that kind of power, that elevation, that desire to be powerful and noticed and have status, it usually comes from a place of actually really deep insecurity. Haman is a fragile, insecure man who wanted power for himself, and so he manipulated the king into making a mandate, forcing everyone to bow at his feet. And everything's going swimmingly. He's got all that he wants until Mordecai. Mordecai challenges his power and his authority, and he refuses to bow down to him. Mordecai won't pander to his ego. And despite all his wealth, all his power, everything he has, he can't force him to do it. And he knows that if one person stands up to him, then the likelihood is, if they get away with it, everyone's going to stand up to him, and before he knows it, that power will be lost. And I know it sounds really crazy, But haven't we all at some point been in a place where we've wanted people to bow down to us? When we've wanted power for ourselves and status and circumstance? I think we all have a little bit of a control issue in our lives, don't we? We don't like it when someone challenges us or doesn't go along with us. And here's the crazy thing. Haman was so bothered by Mordecai that he allows his ego to get completely out of control. And he builds these gallows to impale Mordecai on in the center of the court so everyone can see exactly how powerful he is. But, I told you right at the beginning, there's all these ironic reversals and these mirrorings as the story goes on. The strangest thing is that Mordecai, he builds these gallows to impale Mordecai on them, and actually what he ends up doing is impaling himself. There's this reversal. Because of his ego, the very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, he hangs on himself. Don't let your ego drive you. Because that's what's happening to Haman. And when I think about Putin and I think about all these men in power and women in power, when you look at them, it's ego. It's ego driving them. And it's ego driving the evil of this world. And when Haman can't get what he wants from Mordecai, he gets so caught up in his own insecurities and rage and desire for power and status that he lets his ego take over. It's easy to do, isn't it? Someone new shows up at work, they're all shiny and new, and everyone loves them, and they've got brilliant new ideas, and suddenly everyone's going to them instead of you, and they're treading on your toes, and your kingdom is being encroached upon, and actually you're feeling a bit threatened. So you make sure they know just how powerful you are. It's easy to fall into that trap. And in these kinds of situations, we can feel really insecure and threatened. And if we're honest, we feel dethroned. We feel dethroned. And so if you go about making decisions out of your own hurt and doing things to seize power everywhere you go, thinking you're putting things right, but you're not, what you're doing actually is you're putting yourself on the throne and removing God. Haman, like so many people, is living with that overwhelming need to be needed and respected and seen. And we all have that to a degree. But his desire for power is so great that the way in which he's feeding it is by taking more and more and more and more power for himself. And he's completely removed God from the situation. And I would just remind us all today not to look for security in power and status, or elevation, or praise of others. How many likes you have on Facebook or Instagram. Because it won't fulfill you, and you'll always need more. And eventually, we know what happens. We become the bad guy in the Book of Esther. Our only real security is found in God and God alone, and we have to worship him, not power. And this is the mirror, if you like, that Mordecai holds up to Haman. He reveals to him just what it is he's doing. And the other thing I would say is don't let one person live in your head rent-free. Don't let one mistake, one thing that you do wrong, tear you down forevermore. Because Haman could have chosen to let Mordecai off the hook. He could have chosen to let it go, but he doesn't. And it churns him up. And we need to be careful not to let one situation, one mistake, one failure, one person ruin our lives. Haman could have done things so differently. We have a redeeming God who forgives us and redeems us and saves us. And so not only can we forgive other people, but we can forgive ourselves when we get things wrong. And we need to make sure that we don't let one person ruin everything. Okay, if we fast forward, Haman, he rolls the dice, doesn't he? We see him do that. And he orders the genocide of the Jews. And that's where we pick up the story again. So Mordecai, he's learned of all that had been done in bringing this mandate. And because he had not bowed down to Haman, now Haman was not just going to destroy him, but he was going to destroy all the Jews. And there must be so many things going around in Mordecai's brain at this point, don't you think? Have I done the right thing? Oh my gosh, my actions are going to kill everyone. You know, like, have you ever done that? You thought you were making the right decision, you thought you were following what God was telling you to do, and then all these things start to go wrong, and you think, what, have I done the wrong thing? Is it my fault? What's happening? And he must have had conflict within himself. I reckon there must have been a load of layers of what was going on in his heart at that time. And I think, it's really easy to be tempted to compromise on behalf of people that you love. Because if he'd known everyone was going to be put in that situation, he may not have done it. I think the times when I compromise the most is when I want to make something right or comfortable for someone I really care about. When I want to make it easy for them. Do you do that? But Mordecai, instead of just brushing it aside, he puts on sackcloth and ashes, doesn't he? And he goes out weeping and wailing into the courts. He goes as far as the king's gate. And he's just really grieving, and he's coming to terms with the way in which he's feeling. And this edict that has been put out that all the Jews are going to die. This is terrible. And in those days, by putting on sackcloth and ashes, it was a form of ancient grieving, as I've just said, but it's also a way in which that they could identify with the issue or the loss that was taking place in their lives. And having sat and prayed for everybody this week, I had no intention of taking the sermon in this direction, but I just really felt that there are so many of us in a place where we're grieving, where we're sad, where we're afraid, where we are fighting situations or illnesses that are just completely out of our control, and we just need a moment to grieve. Mordecai, he puts on this sackcloth and ashes, and he's not afraid to show everyone that he's not okay. And the thing is, if you don't process the pain within you, you project the pain. Hurt people, forgiven people, forgive people. And you have to name the loss, because if you don't, it will own you. And it takes courage to deal with pain in any form, and it takes courage to deal with grief, and it takes courage to deal with loss, and it takes courage to grieve, especially in a place where we're expected to just get over things really quickly. The first thing any of us probably say is, well, at least they're in a better place. And we mean well, and they probably are in that better place, but it's still loss. And secondly, it takes courage to get help and ask others to come into your life and to help you deal with that hurt and damage. Because if we don't, and we just try and deal with it on our own, or we just try and bury it, we end up burying ourselves as well. And when we don't process the pain, we become the pain. And what we see here is Mordecai going through the process of grieving and processing what's happened. And we have to tell ourselves it's all right not to be all right. It's okay not to be okay. I'm here this morning, my foot really hurts. You're here this morning and fill in the blank. It's not about feeling sorry for yourself or keeping a stiff upper lip or being proud and saying, I'm fine. It's about coming to your family and saying, actually, I'd really love you to pray with me. I'd really love you to stand in the gap for me and help me through this. Because it's horrible where I am, not me. Just filling in the blanks. It's all right to not be all right. And it takes courage to grieve, especially in a culture that wants to make everything better for us. What does Esther do? She sees him in sackcloth and ashes, and so she quickly sends him some nice clothes and said, it's all right, just put these on, you'll be fine. She means well. But sometimes we have to let people go through the process. And that's what Mordecai's doing. And he eventually gets to a place where he says, actually, Esther, will you help me? You could really help me. You are in a position that could change everything. I need you to be courageous. I need you to stand up and fulfill your calling, because this is what you've been placed here to do. You are here for such a time as this. And Esther says, okay. Okay, I will. And Esther sends her reply to Mordecai, and she says, go and gather the Jews and all the people in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or 3 nights, and I and my maids are going to do exactly the same. And when we're done, I'll go to the king, even though he hasn't called or spoken to me in 30 days, and if I perish, I perish. And here comes that courage of calling all over again. Because 30 days is a long time. And you're not allowed to go and see the king unless he asks for you. And the only way you could appear before him was if his officials came and got you. And Mordecai's telling her, listen, you've got to risk your life. You've got to do this. You're here for such a time as this. We've got to save our people. Oh, and actually, don't forget, you need to tell him that you're a Jew, because, we didn't tell him that when you married him and when you won that beauty contest. And actually, don't forget that you need to remind him or tell him that there's a plot against him to kill him for a second time. And the person plotting to kill him and you and all his people, or your people, is Haman, his best friend, his second in command, the one he's given authority to. So that's going to cause him pain and shame and, conflict as well. And actually, can you just tell him that this big disaster is about to happen? And can you just make sure it's all on your shoulders, Esther? Because you're here for such a time as this. And he leaves us on a cliffhanger. Esther says, you're all right, if I perish, I perish. But for 3 days, nothing happens. It's like you've just watched a movie and you're waiting for the sequel to come out, and it takes 3 years, and you think, oh. And you think absolutely nothing is happening. But for 3 days, they're fasting and praying, and God is doing the most he does in that silence, in the entire story. It seems as if he's inactive, but I'll show you next week. He does more in those 3 days than you ever thought possible. And there are moments in our lives, there are seasons in our lives when we think God is inactive, but he's more active in those periods than you're ever going to know. And the verse that really struck me when I was thinking about that is that, the verse in Isaiah, and it says, those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. And that's what they were doing. They were renewing their strength. And as Esther's strength was being renewed, so was her courage to stand up and be counted on behalf of other people. We can't end it there. We've got to fast forward to chapter 9. And remember, I said there's loads of these ironic reversals. But it says on the 13th day of the 12th month of the year of the month of Adar, the mandate commanded by the king was to be carried out and to kill all the Jews. On this day, the enemies of the Jew had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables are overturned. The Jews have the upper hand and they defeat their enemies. And Haman and his ego are hung on the gallows. And something I want to tell you this morning, for anyone who is in a season where you need something to change, God is still in the business of overturning tables today. He's still in the business of turning things around. And if you are in the need of deliverance, maybe in your health, your relationship, your reputation, or a decision that has been taken out of your hands that is in fact impacting your family, or maybe even destroying it, maybe you've been languishing in pain and grief for long enough, maybe you've been letting one person, one mistake, one wrong thing dictate your actions for long enough. God is in the business of overturning tables today. He overturns lives today. And so as we bring all this to a close, we're going to spend a moment in worship and preparation for communion. And we're going to just let some music play out. But I would say to you, this is a moment to ask God to turn the table for you. Ask him to meet you in the place that you're in and to bring about his change. So you don't have to do anything. You can stay where you are. We're going to play some music and take a moment to really visualize what those things are. If you'd like someone to pray for you, the prayer team will be at the back. We'd love to do that. But if you want to just sit where you are and ask God, enough's enough. I need you to turn the tables today.